Alright, folks, moving into Module 3 now. Sorry about the delay on the video. Forgot it was a long weekend, but here we are in Module 3. We'll be talking about exit routes, emergency evacuation plans, fire protection plans, and fire protection. Let me get my little laser pointer going there. Just a quick introduction on fires and explosions. They account for approximately 145 fatalities per year as far as industry goes, 3% of total fatalities. So, obviously any death or injury at a workplace is something that needs to be annotated and needs to be mitigated. So that's the purpose of this module, discussing the mitigations and the annotations of the plans. Some of the examples, though, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell from these pictures. Your natural disasters, explosions, tornadoes, hurricanes, workplace hazards such as chemical spills and such as other things like that. Also included on that would be workplace violence. Next slide. There. Okay. So the objectives for this is going to be the benefits of the emergency action plan, identifying the elements of a fire protection plan, conditions under which action plans are necessary, and the shelter in place conditions. Additional objectives, having your escape routes, identifying your escape routes. There are also fire extinguishers, different types of fire extinguishers. We're going to cover what the different types of fire extinguishers are and the application of those particular fire extinguishers, and last but not least, the OSHA's requirements for the proper maintenance of those portable fire extinguishers. So, got a star there. Discussing some of the benefits of an emergency action plan. It's a written document. It's going to control how the employer and the employee are going to handle anything that happens during those workplace emergencies. One of the many possibilities for those workplace emergencies. Benefit of that, having fewer injuries. If you identify an action plan, if there is an action plan in place, you can mitigate the injuries. You can also mitigate the damage to the facility, and reducing confusion. Some of the purposes, everybody's going to have a job to do during the a specific emergency. So if you have this action plan in place, you'll be able to identify who needs to do what, when, and how they're going to do it. Floor plans, also really, really important. If you look in any of the classrooms here at school, if you work in an industrial environment, you'll find floor plans and emergency escape routes. You'll always notice that there are going to be two, the primary and the secondary escape routes. If it doesn't have that, it's always a good idea that when you enter a new area to try to develop your own emergency access route. So that way, in the case of an emergency, obviously you never know when an emergency is going to happen. So it's better to be prepared on the front end versus, going back here where we talked about the confusion. Next slide. So, what are some of the requirements that OSHA has in place for that emergency action plan? You have to have the means of reporting that, the means of reporting the fires and other types of emergencies, the evacuation procedures, emergency escape routes, we just went over that, critical operations, counting of all of your employees. Obviously, if you have 100 employees and you've evacuated your facility, how are you going to be able to account for all of those employees after the facility has been evacuated? Any possible rescue or medical duties of the individuals at your facility, and any contact persons, meaning if there's somebody in charge of certain sections of mostly would be your supervisors or any of the OSHA directors that your facility may have. Some of the other things that are involved on the emergency action plan, obviously there needs to be training involved. You have to review the plans with your employees. Obviously if you don't have a plan, you have to do the initial development of that plan, the assignments of employees to the job. So you're assigned to a certain area. You need to be trained on the emergency action plan of that area, because it may be different if you're in one area of a facility. That evacuation plan may be completely different than an area of another facility, because you could have different types of scenarios that would arise for emergency. For example, this area over here can have chemical spill possibility, and this area over here can have a fire and explosion possibility. So it's not always going to cross over. So you have to, upon the initial assignment, that training needs to take place, and it goes in with that changes of the plan of the employees, if there are any changes on that, or the employees move around, like I just said. Retraining, you remember from your childhood school days, the fire drills. You have to do the practicing with the drills, the evacuation, the gathering of the assembly areas. You need to inform the people where they need to go, when they need to go there, and not to be migrating into the hallways, for example. You need to meet out by the dumpster in the parking lot, for example. And then just more and more training and education of those areas, or the special hazards for that specific area as you go. All right, so like I said, let me get that laser pointer back up. I like that laser pointer. The roles and responsibilities, the threats, the hazards. Like I said, you have to identify the different things in your facility. The emergency contacts. Many of you, when you start employment somewhere, they ask for emergency contacts. Also, if they're going to show you how to use the emergency equipment, in this case here, it looks like there's a first aid kit. There may be other things, defibrillators, or maybe spill containment things, where you're going to clean up the spills, or maybe even things that you need to wear during any of these emergency situations. And then, the emergency shutdown of a facility, the whole shutting everything down, nuclear power plant, for example. So the procedures, this is a bare bones example of the procedures that you can have in an emergency action plan. For those of you who are in the military, you're probably quite familiar with something like this. A lot of people have these things, even for their home lives. If you have not necessarily a reporting of an emergency, but if you're in a facility such as here at the school, we have methods to report emergencies where we have to call security if it's bad enough that we call security, or do we call directly to 911. If we have to exit our facility, we have to have the instructions on how to properly leave it. And if you have those who have limited mobility, it's also important, not a lot of times people think about, if you have an individual that's in a wheelchair, an individual with crutches, how do you designate to get that individual out of your facility? Then there's also fire protection plan. We have a little bullet point there. Fire protection plans, obviously, just like everything else, OSHA likes everything in writing. So your fire protection plan is going to be in writing, held right there in the workplace, and you have the right to be able to review that specific fire protection plan. The employer is going to notify any specific fire hazards. So if you're working in an area and this is required of the OSHA requires your employer to notify you of any fire hazard. So if you're working with something that is extremely flammable, you need to be notified of that in the event of an emergency. So some really important things to keep in mind. And obviously you need to review with your employer all of the parts that are going to apply to you in that fire protection plan. Different things included in the fire protection plan. Your fire hazards, handling of storage of hazardous materials. Here in the shop, we have one of those big yellow flammable cabinets. Doors got to be shut. Anything that we use that is flammable, it's got to be put in there. Ignition sources and controls. So notify or know where your ignition sources are. If you're dealing with torches all the time, you probably don't want to be right next to the gas tanks. And fire protection equipment, is that applicable? Do they have fire protection equipment that needs to be utilized in your facility? Procedures, how do you handle that flammable or combustible waste? You probably don't want to dump it out in the parking lot. Safeguards, handling it. Like I said, you don't want to have to be that torch next to the gas can there. And who is going to be responsible for the maintenance and the control of those. So there's going to be an individual at your facility that needs to be responsible for all of these things. They're going to be the go-to individual for any of your questions and concerns. Another detail in your FPP, understanding your fires. You have to understand what's flammable and how things become flammable. So here we have, another star, some required, the 4 things that are required for a fire to happen. You have the oxygen, the ignition source, the fuel, and the chemical reaction that creates it. And that all together will create that fire situation. So here's some other examples that we would find in the fire protection plan. One of the things I didn't really even know until I went through my OSHA required class was the 30-minute fire watch after any hot work has been conducted in your facility. So if you have an individual that's running a torch, a welding situation, cutoff situations, there are actually, according to OSHA regulations, there needs to be a fire watch posted in that area for a minimum of 30 minutes to verify that there won't be any fires created. A lot of times, fires can be smoldering, and they can be smoldering for an extended period of time before it actually forms into a full all-out fire. So some important things to really keep in mind on that. Also, the proper dispensing of flammables and combustibles. I've seen, you go into a facility and they have an old water bottle that is full of some sort of solvent or chemical, and they're using that to pour onto whatever it is that they're doing, or even the proper disposal of those things. Just like I mentioned in our facility, the flammable cabinets, we have a flammable rag containers that are supposed to be emptied. So when you have these rags that are soaked with these specific flammable chemicals, you cannot just throw them into a regular garbage can because of the spontaneous combustion possibility, especially a rag that's balled up into a little tiny ball there. The heat is going to be generated from that chemical reaction, and eventually that rag could catch on fire. And whatever is around it is also going to be part of that flame source. I did mention the flammable cabinets, as we see one here, a specific, an approved metal gas can here. Good housekeeping. Like I said, you don't want to be leaving these things around out in the open. Storing them away from exits and passageways. You don't want to be blocking any of the exits, as we've already discussed. So a lot of these things, just people, they don't think about all the time, and you need to have viable options to be able to evacuate your facility if you need to. Some examples of your fire protection equipment. You know, it may not necessarily be applicable to your shop. You may not even find this in your shop. Respirators, goggles, things like of that nature. Also, you know, your fire suppression. You'll see fire extinguishers all over the place. You go to gas stations, you'll see a fire extinguisher, and then if you look up at the roof of the overhangs that you're in, little nozzles, and those are all for the fire suppression systems. Those would be considered your fixed systems. Also discussing evacuation of a facility. You know, I gave some of these examples. These are all possibilities that could require evacuation. That could also warrant a shelter-in-place situation. Obviously, if there's a tornado coming to your facility and it is a heavily fortified facility, your best bet is to stay in the facility and not out into the parking lot. You know, on the flip side, if there's an explosion, you probably do want to leave the facility. So, you know, it's one of those things that this comes into the protection plans about what to do in a situation and how to best handle it. You want to mitigate that confusion as much as absolutely possible. In this, you know, we talk about the evacuation. I just kind of briefly touched on these in the last slide. The location, the site, where it's located, if you have to shut down any operations, and such as, you know, the nuclear power plants that I gave you an example of. Fight or flee. You know, you have the evacuation. Do you have your total evacuation? Do you have a designated employee that is going to be fighting the fire? Does your facility have firefighters on site to do this? You know, you have to have those designated employees for those things. Any employees are authorized, and the fire extinguishers. A lot of times, and we're going to see here in a little bit, that fire extinguishers are not always intended for employee use. You know, we can understand how you feel the need if there is something on fire in your facility that you may want to, you know, be quick and put it out. But if you're incorrectly using that fire extinguisher, you may be doing more harm than good. And it may just be a better bet that you evacuate the area and let the professionals or let somebody who's properly trained to handle that situation while you can hightail it out to your meeting area out in the parking lot. You know, obviously, the entire area's fire is too big. Do you stay or do you flee? Can you breathe? You know, is it a situation where there's a you know, chemical fire that you may not be able to breathe safely in that area? Obviously, you got to get out of there. Then, you know, I discussed briefly here at the school our evacuation maps. You know, the two ways out. You always have to have a primary exit and a secondary exit, no matter where you are. Now, yes, you may be in a closet with one door. Obviously, that is only going to have one exit area, but once you get out into the common areas, there need to be a multitude of exits, the primary and the secondary. If that primary is blocked, you need to go to the secondary. You know, normally the primary is going to be the closest area to the outside, but, you know, if that area, like I said, if that area is blocked, you need to know where your secondary area is. Probably a better idea to evaluate these exit routes and know exactly what to do way before an emergency happens, so that way you're not trying to read this map during an emergency. Well, and other things it says on here. Any location of fire extinguishers, I've seen these as well, where it has locations of fire alarms, and locations of eye wash stations, locations of PPE stations, anything that could be needed for the situation at hand. And then, you know, going a little bit more in depth of the conditions requiring the evacuation, you know, how do you alert people that they need to evacuate? You know, here at the schools we have the fire alarms. Do you have an area where it's going to be too loud to where people can't hear the fire alarms? Or if you have those who are hard of hearing, how do you notify them? here we have those flashing lights, and actually in my office there is a flashing light but no loudspeaker. So, you know, if we see the flashing light going on, we won't hear the speaker, but we know that it's going to be time to evacuate. So, you know, how would you notify those employees? Yeah, you know, you have to understand, if they're not going to hear you, sound isn't going to do you any good. Accounting for everybody who's exited, we've already discussed that. You know, and then when do you receive the all clear, or are you're out in the parking lot and they come out and say, hey, you know, this is our lucky day, we're all going to go home today, don't come back to work tomorrow. You know, those are situations where you need to keep everybody informed about what they need to do. You can't be out in the parking lot and just say, well, I've had enough, let's go back inside because, you know, I don't see any problem. Well, there may be a problem that you don't know about. You know, we discussed sheltering in place. You know, there may be situations where you do need to shelter in place. Like I said, the severe weather, the tornado situations. And this here they give an example of if there's any release of chemical, biological, or radiological contaminants. So it may not necessarily be safe to be outside. Your best bet is to stay inside. So if you're sheltered in place, the best area to go is, it says right here, interior rooms with no or few windows. You know, if you're in your own home, they always say it's the center of the house, the lowest level, possibly a closet or underneath the stairs. Things to, you know, if you can find those areas, you know, because those should all be identified as safe areas to go through in the protection plan. You know, you don't want to have employees running around saying, where am I supposed to go? A lot of times, actually, when I've worked in industrial environments, I've worked as a machinist my entire career, and I've worked with very large machines, and in the building that I was in, it was roughly about 2 acres under one roof. I could identify every single machine in which bay those machines were in that had underground pits that I could get into. You know, if a situation were to happen where I was at. And, you know, the facilities that I've worked at, it definitely warranted knowing where those areas were if it did ever have to shelter in place. So, you know, like I said, I've said it before, I've said it probably 3 or 4 times so far, know this stuff long before any of these situations happen. I've met many people that when they go to restaurants, the very first thing they do is identify all of the exits in that area, and they will also sit with their back to a wall. So that is part of their protection plan, and they're doing this before any possibility for an emergency does come up. Just some more, you know, the conditions for requiring shelter in place. Shelter in place, who's accounting for, and how do you keep your employees informed. Exit routes, briefly touched on this, or I mentioned don't put those chemicals in front of the doorways. Exit routes are required to be clearly marked, well lit, and the appropriate width, and unobstructed. You cannot have things in front of doorways. If that is an exit route, you know, you cannot park a cart in front of the doorway. They're also required through OSHA regulations to have lit exit signs, or not always lit, but they have to have the exit signs. They do have to be clearly marked, but they don't necessarily have to be lit. But you have to identify that it is an exit area. So if we see right here, there is something blocking that exit route. So that is clearly against regulations. Basic requirements, though, they need to be permanent, fire-resistant materials, you know, steel, brick, things like that. Even long burn sheetrock, fire-rated sheetrock. Adequate, you have to have the adequate number of routes. Remember, I discussed the primary and the secondary routes. Leading directly outside, or to a place with access to outside. You know, I've seen in some of the OSHA classes that I've taken some pictures where they have an exit where it exits into an area that it's like an exit sign for the room they're in, but it exits into an area that's not where they should be going to leave the facility, and they think that they're following the regulations because that's what they have. Adequate capacity, primary, secondary. Obviously, like I said, if you're in a closet, you have a primary. And minimum height and width. You're probably not wanting to go through a door that's 1 foot wide and 2 foot tall to get out of an area. So you have to have your 3 elements of the escape route, like I said, exit access, nearest exits from all points of a building, and you'd have to have that pathway away from the building structure. Alright, so next slide here, talking about the extinguishing of your fires. The training is required for all employees authorized to use the fire extinguisher. So not all employees in a facility can actually be authorized to use fire extinguishers. We're going to discuss a little bit more. We're going to see some of the things that it does go more than just taking a fire extinguisher, seeing a fire, and aiming it at it and putting the fire out. There's actually training that is involved on that. We're going to see in a couple of slides here. We talk about the operation of the equipment. You have to have the instruction, the hands-on practice, where an authorized individual is training an individual on how to use that firefighting equipment. And all of that training needs to be updated at least annually, year after. So, like I said, not everybody's authorized to use it in a facility. If you are properly trained, then you are henceforth authorized. So, another kind of bullet point there. 5 different classes of fires. And we're going to discuss the extinguishers applicable for these in the upcoming slides. But these are the 5 classes of fires. Ordinary combustibles, flammable liquids, electrical equipment, combustible metals. So not a lot of people realize that there is some metal out there that actually is flammable. Magnesium is highly flammable, and actually most metal dust is flammable as well. And if you have any steel wool at home, don't say I told you to do this, but go out into your driveway with a little piece of steel wool and a lighter, and you would be surprised that steel wool will actually catch on fire, even though it's metal. It's interesting. Not a lot of people understand that metal can actually be flammable, and there is a fire extinguisher is designated just for metals that are combustible. And then your cooking oils and greases. So, the procedures to operate a fire extinguisher to try to get that fire put out. Different parts of a fire extinguisher, you're more than welcome to pause it and look at those. Different types of extinguishers, different things that they'll fill the extinguisher up with, and actually in the next slides here we're going to talk about what some of them are. Class A fire extinguishers, water or water or air pressurized water. So if you go back and look at what those Class A fires are, never going to be using them on a liquid fire or an electrical fire. So if we see here, it's common combustibles. You don't want to be using those. Definitely don't want to be spraying water on an electrical fire. Class B, Class C, carbon dioxide. One of the big things you want to watch out for on carbon dioxide, CO2 fire extinguishers is using them in a confined space. Obviously, if you are removing the oxygen from the area, then you are not going to be able to breathe. So, things to kind of consider on that. There we go, we got a little star there. ABC fire extinguishers. These are my favorite, actually. I have these placed a couple of places throughout my garage and in my house. Those ABC fire extinguishers. They're authorized for use in those confined spaces. Basically, they're powder. One of the things that kind of works with this dry chemical well is it's baking soda. You know, I've actually used baking soda before to put out a fire. It's kind of more smothering it, but it's your fire retardant powder. Class K, you'll find these a lot of times in the kitchens. It says kitchens. We're trying to think the restaurant kitchens where they have these Class K fire extinguishers. Whatever potassium bicarbonate it is, it's essentially that's used to extinguish that fire. Built-in hood suppression system. Electroconductive extinguishing. I've never actually used a Class K, so I'm not really sure exactly how it works. So it'd be kind of neat to see all these things in operation one time. Some of the different steps on doing and utilizing a fire extinguisher. We see the pass technique. If I go to the next slide here, we see instructions on the pass technique. This is essentially how to properly use a fire extinguisher. Obviously, pull the pin. Sometimes you have to explain the things, break them down, real simple terms. Pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. In the video, if you guys watch the video in Blackboard, there's an individual trying to put out a fire, and he is not putting out the base of the fire. He is trying to extinguish the flame of the fire, and the fire just keeps getting bigger. The base of the fire is what's actually on fire. The flames are up in the air. That's not what's actually burning. So I've seen people try to put out fires before by not trying to extinguish the base of the fire. And obviously, when in doubt, you better evacuate that area. Last thing here, and then there's just 2 picture slides that you guys can look at on your own. Extinguisher maintenance. One of the big things that is required is the annual maintenance checks are required per OSHA regulations. I think if I have the CFR 1910-157E3, that is the requirement for the annual maintenance check of your fire extinguishers. And I'll let you guys go through this and see if you can identify the issues on this. Now, when you go into Blackboard, if you actually open up this slide, you'll see the notes where it explains what these issues are, and then you can go through and kind of say, oh, okay, I understand that. And then just another situation, can you identify what's wrong with this? And maybe you guys can try to look at this, try to figure out what's wrong with it before you actually go and look at the solutions, which are going to be located in the PowerPoint, which is located on Blackboard. And with that, that is the end of this week's module. Discussion board question on fire extinguishers. If you used one, do you have them in your house? And there is a quiz to be done. Like I said, any questions, Lafayette Hall, you can come and talk to me. If you're even watching these videos, I appreciate it. I put them up here just that way I know that sometimes it's easier to talk to people than not, and just kind of seeing PowerPoints. So anyway, with that, I guess I'll wrap it up for this week. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.